Hello, and we are back again on EOTK Insider with the lovely Neil Jones. How are you doing today, Neil?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you, mate?
Yes, I'm not bad at all. Not bad at all. It's I was saying to you just before, it's been a bit of a shocking kind of few sort of days of worth of developments really on the Liverpool front. We'll dive into that shortly. Of course, Fabinho being sort of the prominent example there. I just want to firstly touch on the training camp in Germany, which of course Fabinho hasn't travelled with the squad to go to. Jurgen himself has already paid tribute to a few of the youngsters: Conor Bradley, Bobby Clark, Ben Doak. I just want to check whether does that track with what you've been hearing in terms of how the camp's been going so far, in terms of who's been impressing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the camp, but I think the first week, last week at Kirby, clearly a few youngsters put themselves at the front of the queue. And I mean, Bobby Clark and Ben Doak were probably already there. They were two who featured in the first team last season at various points. But if you look at some of the other names on the list, Lewis Kumas, for example, if you look at James McConnell, who's a young midfielder from the under-18s who's gone on the trip, they've clearly put themselves there. You know, they've impressed in that first week and made sure that they were on that plane. And good luck to them. You know, there's always a couple, isn't there, that sort of come from nowhere and we haven't really heard of, or we haven't really seen much of, and they become, you know, the sort of the talked about thing in pre-season. Well, a couple of opportunities for players like that, and like you say, for Conor Bradley, who spent last season on loan, did everything that was asked of him going on loan, went above and beyond really in terms of, you know, playing every game and sweeping the board at the Bolton Wanderers Player of the Year awards. So yeah, I think this is always it's obviously not the big talking point at the moment, is it? But it's always the sort of the thing that I really enjoy about pre-season, is just seeing which youngsters take that little next step. And, you know, I think if you look at some of the names there, Jarell Kwanzaa, Lewis Kumas, and in particular, James McConnell and Callum Scanlon as well, another young defender as well, left back. It's a great couple of weeks for them, and real chance for them to put themselves in the manager's eye.
I mean, before we get on to sort of more difficult or perhaps more unsavoury topics, I'm kind of curious. Obviously, you mentioned Callum Scanlon on your latest sort of YouTube video. Stefan Bajcetic is the one name sort of prominently broke through last year, and deservedly so, before his injury curtailed at the end of the season. Who are you sort of personally backing to stand out this season and sort of perhaps, you know, make that step up, get 10, maybe 20 appearances in total?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a big ask. Maybe it'll be made easier by some of the, you know, the transfer stories that we're going to go on and to discuss. If you were asking me that in terms of talent and potential, I would say Ben Doak is the one that looks like the way he plays lends itself to being on the bench, doesn't it? And being brought on in games potentially. And certainly, you know, if you've got the Europa League and you've got the domestic cups, if Liverpool have a run in those, I think there's a possibility that you'll see Ben Doak used more this season. I mean, he played, I think 5 games last season. So yeah, if you were looking at that again and double that potentially. Longer term, I look at the fullbacks and I look at the sort of, you know, the potential to develop a young fullback and the money that you can save by doing that. And I look at Conor Bradley. I think he's got the game to play in the Premier League. I think he's got to obviously he's got to find that level and develop physically. I think Luke Chambers on the other side, who's not in the squad for the camp, I think he'd probably go out on loan this season. But I look at him as a long-term possibility. And like you say, Callum Scanlon was signed around the same time as Stefan Bajcetic. He came from Birmingham. Bajcetic obviously came from Celta Vigo. He's had a bit of a tough time. He's had a few injuries, and he didn't play an awful lot last season. But when he came back at the back end of last season, he was really flying, really looking like a good player. And he's obviously got a chance to go with the first team. So yeah, I think he's got something to keep an eye on, definitely. But if you were talking about the next sort of 6-12 months, Ben Doak is the player I think who's at the front of the queue.
Very exciting stuff as well. I think, especially when we're looking sort of that sort of right hand sort of forward role as well.
He's a real throwback as well. He's a winger that no matter what, you know, sort of where he ends up in his career in terms of the level he finds, he'll be exciting. He'll always be one that you'll want to watch because he's always trying to take people on. He's always trying to get to the byline, get into the penalty area. He's got a really direct style of play. And I think that, like I say, I think that lends itself to being a sub to start with, because you can bring him on for 10-minute bursts and have a run of tired legs at fullbacks. I mean, we saw him, what he did to Luca Dean last season, didn't we? And we saw him, you know, when he came on against Derby in the Carabao Cup. So yeah, he's one that gets people off their seats, definitely.
I think as long as you've got that sort of pathway there, the door's open. Do you know what I mean? To impress, and I think it's always nice as well to have a Scot in the squad as well. I think as many as we can get, really. Now onto sort of more unpleasant matters, and that is, of course, the Henderson and Fabinho situation. You've obviously reported, as we mentioned, he's not in the 32-man squad that travelled to Germany for pre-season. Al-Ittihad's offers come in at 40 million. The club have, I believe, have given him permission to kind of undergo all the sort of formalities of a potential deal. I just want to touch firstly on what the internal reaction has been within the squad, within the management, the coaches, because I imagine, this has taken everyone quite by surprise. It's not really an eventuality I imagine everyone was planning for right at the start of the window.
Yeah, absolutely. It was described to me this weekend by someone within the club as a disruptor. That was the word that they used, and I think that's the perfect word to describe it. It's we've trailed for a long time the idea of a midfield rebuild. And listen, there were times last season, I think myself and I think others would have included Fabinho in that midfield rebuild because his form wasn't great. But really, when sort of the clear heads took hold, the idea that you would get rid of Fabinho this summer just didn't really cross a lot of people's minds, I don't think. And as much, I suppose, for the fact that you maybe didn't think you'd get an offer that was worthwhile, but also the fact that he's such a specialist. He's the only real, say natural, but specialist defensive midfielder in the squad. Some people can play there and maybe develop into being that, but he is the only one who plays that position and plays only that position. So for this to appear, and not just appear, to appear relatively late in the window, you class it. Of course, we're still in July, but we're less than a month from the start of the new Premier League season, so it is late, and it doesn't give you a lot of time. It also means that some players that maybe you might have considered might have moved already, or might be already signing new contracts, or off the market otherwise. So it does give Liverpool a lot to do. I think the reaction has been, like you said, I think you used the word unpleasant earlier. I think that's it. It's an unpleasant surprise, I think, for Liverpool to be in this position. I don't think they can really stand in his way. I think the money is good enough for the player, in isolation, but it does leave them with a lot of work to do. It leaves them with some big decisions to make over the next few weeks, not just in terms of who they target, but the type of sort of the way they set up their midfield. Can they get another Fabinho, or do they need to sort of completely redesign it? Do they need to accelerate what they do with Trent Alexander-Arnold and maybe sort of just plan him as a midfielder? Do they then need to look at right backs? There's a lot to unpack with it. But yeah, I think it's something that, I don't know the squad's reaction, but I imagine it would not, have gone down too well with the squad either, in terms of, I think they would have been obviously used to the idea of having Fabinho at the base of their midfield. I think there'll be a lot of uncertainty there as well. We haven't even touched on Jordan Henderson yet, of course, the captain, being in a similar position. But yeah, I think it's I think the word disruptor, which was used to me this weekend, I think is pretty much perfect for this.
Disruptor doesn't sound great, does it?
It can do. You, I've heard it described by players that you can sign a disruptor and someone who can break up play. But yeah, this is breaking up breaking up plans rather than play.
No, in this context, it's not particularly pleasant. You talk about getting potentially another Fabinho. One name that you've personally championed on your YouTube channel is that of Benfica's Florentino Luis. I will throw further names at you, but I really want to focus on this one first, because you've described him as a Fabinho type player. Interestingly, his former coach, and I'm going to butcher this name, João Tralio, I believe, compared him to Casemiro and is backed him already to become an elite player in future. You mentioned that Liverpool aren't officially looking at him yet. I just want to check firstly, has that situation changed at all? Is that name sort of cropped up?
Yeah, well, no. They've definitely looked at him in the past, Florentino Luis. He's someone who's had a bit of an odd career. He's been at Benfica for many years, but he's been out on loan. He went to Monaco, he went to Getafe in Spain, and he's only really sort of started to establish himself at Benfica, in the last year or two. And last season in particular, I think he took huge strides forward. And he was. I spoke to people who know him well and who know it, the Benfica system, and they said he really became the sort of a real linchpin. And obviously Enzo Fernandez was alongside him in the first half of the season. He went on and earned a huge move to Chelsea. But there was a lot of people said, he wouldn't have looked as good, Enzo Fernandez, without having someone alongside him like Florentino, who, from I mean, from what I've seen of him and what I know, and you do your research. Defensive work is just it's huge. He gets through numbers of interceptions, tackles. Breaking up play, winning possession. It's scary. I think he was right up with the best in Europe in the Champions League and in the top 5 leagues. So, you talk style wise. If you were looking at a Fabinho replacement and you wanted a Fabinho, the size of him, the type of player he is, the position he plays, like you say, João Chalau, who I spoke to for the piece. I think it was ahead of the Benfica played Leipzig. I think was it Leipzig they played? In the Champions League, Salzburg possibly.
One of the 2 Red Bulls.
Yeah, I think it was Salzburg, and he said to me, you compare him to these top midfielders. He said, I do think he has the ceiling to be one of these top defensive midfielders. The problem is, and there's a few problems, but Benfica sold Enzo Fernandez in January. They sold him for an incredible price. They don't tend to sell players on the cheap. Darwin Núñez, another example, obviously. So if you're talking about taking another linchpin of their team or another central pillar of their team, then you're going to have to pay the money. Whether Liverpool would pay, £80 million for someone like that, I don't know, possibly. I haven't heard that they've pushed him to the front of the queue. I think there's an awful lot of names on this list at the moment, and Liverpool I wouldn't say they're throwing darts at the board, but I think they're trying to find the strategy, really. I think at the moment there's potential that they could go in a couple of different directions, and if you just look at the sort of range of names that have been linked, I'm sure we're going to go on to talk about them. You can see that there's still a bit of uncertainty as to the type of player or the level of player that Liverpool are going to try and sign in the next few weeks. But I think if they were to go down the route of a like for like with Fabinho, I think Florentino Luis would be A, someone they'd consider, and B, someone who would be ideal.
There's a number of considerations, I think, within this. We've seen reports that suggest that Luis's release clause numbers above £100 million. But as you mentioned, even if it doesn't, you're looking at Enzo Fernandez being a benchmark. We've got Darwin Núñez as a benchmark. We're talking another quality midfielder player. I'm very much down. Benfica would be prepared to say, we'll take 40 million for him. Obviously, that's what we're getting in for Fabinho. We were prepared, perhaps, maybe, to meet that for Romeo Lavia. So that's another situation that potentially affects. Does bringing in a 23-year-old then affect how we look at Bajcetic's development? Because obviously we had a relatively perfect scenario where we had Fabinho at 29, you think maybe 2-3 years, by which point, Bajcetic is well into his 20s already, and that pathway is a lot smoother. I suppose I want to firstly touch, is that release clause figure accurate, or would it be more looking at sort of Fernandez as sort of a benchmark?
Yeah, I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Benfica, that's how they deal, isn't it? They do release clauses, and they were able to do it with Enzo Fernandez, when they were able to hold out and say, no, you're going to have to meet it. They found a willing dance partner in Chelsea. I don't think anyone realistically would pay that for Florentino. I think it would be more of a trying to negotiate it. And you've seen it with Darwin Núñez, Liverpool. They were able to negotiate a fee that was lower than what Benfica originally wanted. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of money, put it that way. And I think the other thing, that the knock-on effect of this with Fabinho, obviously we're talking about it being a disruptor for Liverpool. The rest of the world knows that as well, don't they? The rest of the world knows that, it's not when the phone flashes up and it's Liverpool's number, everyone knows what they're after, don't they? They're not able to sort of keep the poker face and say, oh yeah, we might want a midfielder, we might not, we might want a number 6, maybe not. Everyone knows now their need is great, and that does have its own impact, obviously, on the market. That all of a sudden, I'm sure a few more players are getting pushed their direction, but also I'm sure a few clubs are putting a little bit more sauce on top of the transfer fee as well that they're asking, and they know that time's ticking. Liverpool, what is it, 30 days till the first Premier League game of the season, if that. So yeah, I mean, we're in a position where Liverpool's need is great, and they don't have a huge amount of time on their side either, which doesn't lend itself to perfect transfer dealings.
Well, we'll look at the sort of other names on the list sort of generally. So we've seen anyone across Sofian Amrabat, João Palhinha, Calvin Phillips, Ryan Gravenbach, Romeo Lavia, of course. One name I'm particularly curious about is one that you've mentioned, is Toon Koopmeiners. We saw reports back in January that Liverpool was scouting him. Linders was reportedly a fan. Can play as an 8, a 6, as a centre-half and he's left-footed, which is a key consideration in that, I think, as well. The contract runs out in 2025, so you think the asking price wouldn't be totally astronomical. Speaks English, already has a working relationship with Virgil van Dijk, Cody Gakpo now. I don't know. Maybe the boxes are too many boxes are ticking in my mind. I'm sure that there's obviously plenty of other factors Liverpool will consider beyond that, not least of all character. But what sort of stands out there from Liverpool's list? Is there already a hierarchy in place, or are these just sort of names that have been thrown up in the air at the moment?
I think all of these names are liked by Liverpool, or at least sort of appreciated as potential options. I don't think it's any secret that, for example, Ryan Gravenberch is someone at Liverpool. If the deal made sense financially and was available, I think Liverpool would like to do it, or would have liked to have done it this summer. In terms of coat miners, I think the issue is that we don't know yet what Liverpool actually want. So do they want a Fabinho? In which case, you would probably say coat miners no, because he's not a Fabinho. He's a little bit more multifunctional. He plays, a few different roles. He's probably not a specialist, is he? In any of those roles, he's a talented player and he's got potential. But he would be, if you were buying a Fabinho and then you wanted someone to play a little bit around that and fill in and maybe do maybe more of a Henderson sort of type replacement, maybe. But if you do want, you're going to go down a different route. Look, we're not going to have a Fabinho replacement. What we're going to do is we're going to put Trent in there, and we're going to have someone alongside him who's got a range of passing that's like Xabi Alonso, or we're going to go down a road of someone who carries the ball forward, who dribbles from deep and does those kind of things. So we don't know yet what strategy Liverpool are going on. I'm loath to say I don't think Liverpool know, but I haven't yet had the conversation with anyone that's like, no, right, this is where the plans are. I think it's obviously still quite fresh. The offer for Fabinho arrived on Friday. The interest in Fabinho only really sort of emerged a week ago, if that. So it is still quite new for them. I think they're still finding sort of the idea of what Jurgen wants to do with the team setup. Don't forget, of course, they signed someone in Alexis McAllister who, if you do play with two number sixes, and if you do want to play a different style, he could play in there. They've still got Thiago, who for now, that could play in there with someone else, and you could play that sort of that double pivot with him. I mean, Henderson's still at the club. I think he probably, there's every chance he does leave, but he's still there for now. So there's a lot to sort of decide strategically first before you start looking at who's the ideal signing for Liverpool. I mentioned, I think Florentino, for example, I think Amrabat fits into that Fabinho type player, a real defensive midfield. I think João Palhinha fits into that certainly as a destroyer in there. But if you're going in a different direction, then other names come straight back into view, don't they? And just as a name that I don't know, I don't think Liverpool would say no if it was a deal that could be done. But you look at, there was a story yesterday in Germany about Leon Goretzka potentially leaving Bayern Munich. He's someone who's 28. He's really experienced, a physical sort of player. He's a bit different, obviously, to Fabinho, but he's someone that, if you were going in a different direction and you wanted a different type of player in there, and you wanted someone who's experienced and who's played at the top level, and there's a player there that could potentially be available. So that opportunity might also dictate where Liverpool go in terms of what type of player they target.
No, I think Goretzka's an interesting shout. I think because it does, for me, it does boil down to how they view players like Bajcetic, potentially Lavia, whether they still intend on getting him. Obviously, now this is kind of throwing a spanner in that works. Because if they do believe Bajcetic has all the ingredients, or Lavia has all the ingredients to be a player that can be your first choice for years to come from like 21, 22, 23, you're probably not serving their interests well by getting in another sort of 23-year-old or someone of that ilk. So someone of that kind of similar age profile to Fabinho really would be ideal. Just to move on to Jordan Henderson, you mentioned, it's looking like, he could also join Fabinho and leave the club, which seems insane, really, given, I think last week we were talking about those two players being, the ones you wouldn't sell. Thiago was the one we were thinking about. What's the current position now on that particular front with Al-Ettifaq? Because we've seen varying reports that, they wanted to quadruple his wages. Some have said actually no, it's not as much than that. It's around the 200,000 mark. What's the current situation?
Yeah, well, it hasn't moved. Is as far as I know since sort of late last week when obviously it all blew up with the talk of the offer that had been made to Jordan, the fact that he was leaning towards accepting it. Of course, he travelled with the squad on Saturday, which was pretty significant given who stayed behind. So it suggests that nothing's been agreed, certainly. And Liverpool's stance has been they're aware of the interest, they're aware of the players, if not is absolute determination to leave, but certainly is the fact that he, like you say, leaning towards leaving, the fact that his head's been turned, put it that way. But their stance has been, okay, well, let the club make the offer and let's see what we can do, about that. And as of yet, I don't believe there's been certainly not been an acceptable offer made to Liverpool. I don't even know if there's been an actual offer made by Al-Ettifaq. There was obviously talk last week that they believe they could get it done on a free transfer. That was dismissed. I mean, I was laughed off by Liverpool. Even the idea of sort of a 7 to 10 million price tag was laughed off, and it was sort of spoke about straight away that, try doubling that, really. And you've seen the name, I'm sure you've seen it, but Kalidou Koulibaly's name has been used. That's sort of Liverpool's gauge really on these things. And they do that quite a lot when they're selling players. They look at comparable deals that have been done elsewhere. And Koulibaly was 32, went from Chelsea for 17 million, I think, or up to 20. So I think you could take that as a very fair reference point for Jordan Henderson, who's Liverpool's captain, is starting games for them, played 40 odd games last season. I think he's only missed 6 Premier League games in the last 2 years. So it's certainly not, they're not taking a fringe player. They're taking someone who's quite significant at Liverpool, if they do. And so it's down to them to find the offer that Liverpool accept. It does feel strange when you read it and you say, obviously, you hear this offer that's been made for Jordan. I believe it's a very significant offer. I don't think we're talking Premier League wages for Jordan Henderson. I think we're talking sort of wages that you just wouldn't get in at 33 in the Premier League. If you're talking about that, and then you're talking about them sort of haggling over a transfer fee, it just feels a bit strange, doesn't it? In that sense. But I think there'll be developments this week, obviously. I think it'd be interesting to see if it's not done by Wednesday. There's a friendly match with Karlsruhe, obviously. It'll be interesting to see whether Jordan plays in that. Interesting to see, obviously, because there'll be media at that game. What the first question that Jurgen's going to be asked pre and post match, what's going on. It'll be interesting to see what sort of answer he gives, whether Jordan himself speaks out. I'd expect things to start moving forward this week on that.
There's plenty of angles we can sort of go at from here, really. One thing I want to sort of touch on, really, is the captaincy situation, where this would leave Liverpool. We know there was a 6-man group, of which the likes of Virgil van Dijk, Trent Alexander-Arnold, Alisson Becker are all part of. Hypothetically, I would assume the next in line would be Virgil van Dijk, but I imagine there's got to be a level of temptation on the club's part to hand it over to a local lad, an academy graduate, in Trent Alexander-Arnold. He's of that age, of that maturity now, where it would almost, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking of it too romantically, but it would make sense to a certain degree if you're sort of looking at sort of where you want to take the club in the next sort of era, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it would. If he didn't have 2 years left on his contract, then you're going to have to renegotiate that at some point. So whether that's factored into the negotiations or not, possibly, that could be a sort of a double unveil. I think it'll be Van Dijk who would take the captaincy if Jordan left. And then obviously, if you think about Van Dijk, what's 30, 31, 32, so you potentially got Trent to grow into that and become it, in 2 years' time, say, maybe move into the vice captaincy role. Obviously, there's other players there, Andy Robertson, Alisson Becker, obviously, are around there. We were already discussing, weren't we, potentially, I think maybe Mo Salah moving up and being part of that leadership group. It always felt a bit strange that he never did, given how long he's been at the club and the impact that he's had and the sort of the standards that he sets. You would have thought he'd be ideal. So yeah, I would say it'd be Van Dijk, but I completely understand that point. That sort of symbolism, really, that look, this is our star almost. This is our sort of our figurehead for the next, like you say, next 5-10 years. There's obviously a situation with Alexander-Arnold's contract that probably needs to be resolved in the next few months. I don't think it'll be a problem necessarily, but until that is, maybe that, you don't want to be also burdening him with captaincy as well. He seems to it seems to be the response, doesn't it, when he has a tough time, Alexander-Arnold, the sort of the way to get the best out of him is to give him more and more responsibility, put him in midfield or put him on set pieces and, sort of really, really make your team built around him. I think he will be captain of Liverpool one day for sure. I think it might just be in a year or two.
I mean, you mentioned about the contract situation. I think I'm loath to say that, don't worry about that. Liverpool will absolutely get that sorted, because I mean, we both, and imagine many Liverpool fans, didn't expect this Henderson and Fabinho situation.
What we're talking about with wages is it just distorts the market, doesn't it? You're trying to renew a contract on, like I say, on Premier League money, and players know this. You can't speak for every player. I think Son Heung-min today's come out and said, hasn't he, that he had a huge offer to go to Saudi and he's turned it down. Some players will, some players it won't be a factor. But I tell you what, if you're an agent and you're negotiating wages for top players, new contract, you're at least going to be sort of mentioning the money that's on offer in Saudi, and you're at least going to be in your mind somewhere. And I think what this has done in the last week, from the Henderson in particular, it's sort of given a reminder to sort of every club in the Premier League that your players are touchable. There will be a figure, or there will be a sort of a way that the heads can be turned. And from a Liverpool perspective, that should bring some fears. They've got a few aging players, haven't they, who are still very important. They've got Virgil van Dijk, they've got Andy Robertson, they've got Alisson. The Brazilian contingent is shrinking, obviously, by the day almost. So there will be some fears around those things, but. Yeah, I think I hope and I pray in Trent's case that it's not going to be a major issue.
No, I think the considerations, fortunately, are different. I suppose you could argue from sort of Henderson's perspective in 30s, he's looking at sort of protecting his sort of financial future. Whereas you think for a player like Trent Alexander-Arnold, who seems to could now grow more into sort of the England squad, which seems to be an important consideration for him. As well, it just seems, I don't know, it would seem a bit abnormal for him to consider seriously an offer from Saudi Arabia from a competitive perspective and a personal perspective. It just, I'm hoping.
It would, but I think that will happen at some point with not necessarily with Trent, but there will be a player that's in his, at the start of their career or in their peak years. I mean, we're seeing a few players, you look at Sergej Milinkovic-Savic has gone over, hasn't he? Ruben Neves has gone over. You're sort of looking at a few players. Potentially, I mean, I think Romelu Lukaku's obviously been linked quite strongly. Players who you think they still got good years left in them, in European football, and we would have plotted them going to big European clubs. I think Milinkovic-Savic, for example, has been linked with Real Madrid in the past. Obviously, Ruben Neves was linked with Barcelona quite strongly. So there will be a player that goes from probably an English player that goes, and you think, wow, he's only 21. What are you doing? But I suppose. We can't countenance it. We can all have the moral debate, and we can all sort of say, "Oh, this is not life." Why can you call it life-changing money? Which is something I think. But until it's sort of there, if you're there as a 21-year-old, and someone says to you, "I'll give you £20 million a year for 2 years," and you're 23 when you're finished, and you can go and carry on and try and do what you want, it will turn people's heads. There will be players that there will be bombshells. I think coming in the next sort of. Probably by the end of this window, but in windows to come, where we say, oh, wow, the next big thing's gone over there, or that now they've taken someone's star player. You're looking at Fulham are probably going to lose their top scorer in Mitrovic, from last season. There will be big names, but also younger names, I think, will start to go as well. And it is a very, very strange time and uncertain time, I think, just for the sort of European and the Premier League football ecosystem.
No, I mean, the Netherlands one was particularly shocking at 26. I think you're spot on, though. I think if the Saudi financial bubble doesn't burst like it did in China, I think they will be targeting the opposite ends of the spectrum as well when they're 30, when they're early in their 20s, as you say, and they can still sort of go, well, you can still have a career if this doesn't work out for you when you hit 23. So I think that will be that sort of before they hit that sort of age of maturity, when you're like sort of 24 and 25 and you're thinking, well, now I really need to kick on in a solid top flight league. I just want to touch on what Liverpool's plans are sort of going forward. Obviously, it's clear now, that it's clear to any other club who possesses a holding midfielder that Liverpool are interested in. Liverpool wants a holding midfielder. They want a Fabinho replacement. Where does this figure generally with Liverpool's plans moving forward? Will we see a minimum of 2 players sort of walk into the door? Especially, I would imagine, if Jordan Henderson does go, I think that has to be an absolute minimum requirement. That then might change what they plan for the centre half that comes in, because I imagine Liverpool thinking, well, Christ, we need to spend some serious money here. This isn't just about bringing in a 40 million player who can grow alongside Fabinho. We need genuine quality right now, plus another if Henderson goes.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the fascinating part of it for me, is that I wrote this morning, I wrote a piece on my Substack page about, not since Coutinho left, that was about 5.5 years ago, have Liverpool lost the player they wanted to keep. But in the Fabinho case, the money was that good that you couldn't argue it by the end, once they'd spent the money, that it was a bad thing. It clearly worked out for Liverpool. They were able to go and pretty much finish off their team, weren't they? They were able to finish off the house. The money for Fabinho and Henderson is decent for their age, but it's not like game-changing money, is it? It's not going to sort of, right, you can go and get whoever you want. I wonder what it does for Lavia. I think he's the most immediately interesting case, because if you think that he's got the potential to be your long-term starter, and clearly somewhere down the line someone does, and Arsenal think it and Chelsea think it, they wouldn't be in this mix if not. Do you gamble on him, and do you say, well, do you know what, we're going to just put it on his shoulders and Bajcetic's shoulders, and we'll say, look, see if you can swim. Now, it would be a hugely risky thing, but what it would also enable Liverpool to do is just expedite a couple of other areas. Now they might say, well, tell you what, we're gonna really beef up centre back, or we're gonna buy a right back, and we're gonna put Trent into it as a midfielder. We're gonna just consider Trent as a midfielder, and we're gonna sort a right back out, and that gets rid of a problem down the line for us. There's 4 or 5 real options that they could do. They could do a straight replacement of Fabinho, where they sign Amrabat. They could do that situation where they go on a younger player and maybe try and get another midfielder that's a little bit more sort of multifunctional, like we said about someone like a Koopmeiners or someone like that, and just beef up the sort of the general options where you can just mix and match and sort of make do. They could go and focus on the defence and like I say, and take a gamble on just Lavia as a midfield option. It's a really difficult one. I'm not 100% sure what I would do. My sort of natural tendency would always be carry on what you've been doing in the past. So I'd probably go down and try and find another Fabinho. But there are options available to Liverpool, and I think that the two factors that are most intriguing for me is what they think about Alexander-Arnold and what they think about Lavia, and do they think that those two could be your midfield, your base of your midfield next season? And if so, go and do it. That would be the sort of what I would say. But there's an awful lot more being considered, and I do think you have to as well. You have to factor in Fabinho, 219 games played in just over 5 years at Liverpool. That's, like you say, it's 40 plus games a year. That's a lot of reliability that they're losing in that, and in Henderson even more so. 700 between them games that they've played. They really need to have players who are on the pitch that they bring in. Whoever they sign has to be available. They cannot be taking gambles on players who miss games, 20 games a season through injury, who have a checkered past, or in that regard, they need to be getting as much reliability as they can get in. It might be up and down in terms of form if you're getting a younger player in, and you have those waves, but they need to be players who they can get on the pitch and build something around.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? I think if you were to ask Liverpool, would you rather have a situation where all the sort of positions are ticked off and you just need to bring in a holding midfielder, or would you rather have a position where you need to bring in a holding midfielder, but you've got players like Alex McAllister, Jordan Henderson, who can play the 6, obviously, maybe not as well as Fabinho can. Jones has played there, but I think we talked about this last week. Again, playing there in the Under-21 Championship is very different to playing there in the Premier League. Liverpool will probably say, well, we'd rather have the flexibility. But this then, as you say, creates a problem of, well, if we have Trent coming in as part of the base, is there as much of a need for that sort of singular, holding 6? Or do you just need a versatile player like a Koopmeiners who can just flit in and about? Is there as much of a need of an emphasis? It's an interesting point, I think, for fans to debate. Lastly, before
all I was just going to say is, I think if you look at the rivals Liverpool have got, they've all really got centrepiece midfielder, haven't he? You know, you look at Casemiro, like we said, you look at Declan Rice now, has just gone to Arsenal, you look at Rodri, the impact that he's got at City. So you're looking at, Enzo Fernandez was Chelsea's big signing. So it would suggest that Liverpool would be doing it differently, wouldn't he, if they were going down that route of just having a sort of rotating cast of players who can sort of do a little bit of everything. But, you know, it could work. It's not. That's not to say it can't work. It would be a bit of a removal from sort of trend, if you like. If Liverpool were to go down that route, I would lean towards the idea that they will find a specialist number 6. It's just, I think maybe the question along there is, do they buy 2 of them, or do they buy 1 and a multifunctional, or do they buy a young one or 2 young ones, or you know, do they sort of buy the off the shelf ready made sort of player? There's a lot, I think, still to be discovered in this window, and I mean, I expect it will be discovered quite quickly, because I think Liverpool would. I don't think they're in a position where they can let this drag on into August. I think they need to sort of get there. They need someone who's going to start at Stamford Bridge, pretty much, don't they?
Absolutely, but this is where Schmadtke will be Schmadtke and the coaching staff generally will be pulling their hair out, because if you do, you know, go against the grain here and it goes wrong, you suddenly maybe next summer need to be spending a lot of money on that sort of centerpiece specialist number 6, when you also need to be spending money on revitalizing your back line. You've got Salah's contract right. So this is such a key integral summer. They need to get this one right. Just lastly, because I feel we could go on for ages about the situation. I just want to, it's gone a bit quiet of late, but I wanted to know if you heard anything fresh about sort of Nat Phillips, that we saw reported a couple of weeks ago about Leeds interested, a 10 million figure. Asking price was touted at the time. Has the interest cooled now? Are they still keen?
No, I think it's. I think the 10 million asking price is putting them. I think that's top end. I think people will try and get Nat Phillips cheaper than that. I'd be amazed if Liverpool went for another loan. I mean, he's still got some time on his contract, but if Liverpool was another loan, it just feels, you know, it would feel crazy from his point of view and from the club's. I think Nat will leave this summer. I think he will get a transfer. It's a question of who's going to make the best offer. And I think it'll be less than 10 million. I think Liverpool would love to get 10 million. It might be one of them that, you know, they have these incremental bonuses that, you know, if he wins Ballon d'Ors, he eventually gets up there and things like that. But I think he will leave. He's with the squad. Obviously, I think he's had a bit of a fitness issue that he's been recovering from. I'm not sure he's been in. I think he's only just. He wasn't straight into full training when he came back. I think he is now, or he's certainly in more training. So I think he'll possibly see out this Germany tour, and then we'll see things start to move with him. I think it'll probably be either abroad or the Championship. I would imagine would be his destination. And then the question is obviously who's gonna come up with the money to pay. I saw he was linked with Feyenoord obviously quite recently, wasn't he? Which would, you know, on the face of it seem like a really good move for him. I think Leeds would be a fantastic move for him, or Leicester. You know, if you go into the top end of the Championship for someone who's fighting to get back in the Premier League, I think that might be the way for Nat to become a Premier League player again. You know, to go up with the team and become central to them. So I think he will leave definitely. Listen, I've said it before, and you know I think Nat said it himself almost, and you know he couldn't picture himself still being at the club after the end of a transfer window, and he is. I'd be amazed if that was the case this time. I think he's definitely one that's going to leave.
I think he's more than earned to move, to be honest, by this point. I feel for him, to be honest. He's more than good enough to be at least a mid-table Premier League side, I'd say. Well, I mean, that's all from us here today. It's been all change here at Liverpool. Fabinho's on the way out. Jordan Henderson could soon be following in his footsteps. But this much, obviously, is clear. Liverpool need a holding midfielder. In what form that will take, we will, of course, have to see. We've had the lovely Neil Jones here with us on EOTK Insider, and you can see all his latest work on Substack at neilj.substack.com and on Twitter at neiljonesgoal. This will, of course, be on our Substack at empireofthecop.substack.com. And if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to drop us a like. Let us know your thoughts on all the happenings in the Liverpool transfer space, and drop us a subscribe just for the fun of this cheeky window. This has been EOTK Insider with Neil Jones. Take care.